Have you ever wondered how far someone will go when they believe they are acting in God's name? In a small town surrounded by hills and dirt roads, there stood a simple church with white walls and ancient stained glass windows. There, every Sunday, dozens of worshippers gathered to hear Pastor Elias, a man with a calm voice, a steady gaze, and a presence that seemed to touch the divine. He claimed to free souls, heal the tormented, and lead the lost back to the light. His word was law, his faith unshakable, and no one imagined that, beneath the ground where they knelt to pray, hell was waiting. The locals called him a holy man. They swore that when they heard him preach, they felt a peace that came straight from heaven. He spoke of forgiveness, salvation, and the power of faith, always with an almost hypnotic glow in his eyes. He said God had given him a mission to purify the corrupt, free the possessed, and restore purity to those who had strayed from grace. And who would dare doubt someone who claimed to hear the very voice of God? What no one saw was the hidden side behind the white robe, the man who smiled from the pulpit but hid sin beneath the altar. As the years passed, some of the faithful began to disappear. Young people, women, single men, all devout. They were sent on spiritual missions, the preacher would say, with the calm of someone who has all the answers. And the people believed. After all, questioning the pastor was the same as doubting God's will. Families waited, prayed, wept, but the missing never returned. Have you ever been there? Have you ever believed so much in someone that you couldn't see the danger behind their charisma? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. Pastor Elias was a master manipulator. He used faith as a shield and fear as a chain. He made his followers believe that only he could lead them to salvation, and that whoever betrayed him betrayed God. With each sermon, his power over people increased, and the room for doubt diminished. Rituals became more intense, darker, and more secretive. He said it was necessary to release the evil within each person. No one realized that in the end, it was he who was releasing evil itself, and he did so in the name of faith. Authorities only arrived at the church years later, after a former member decided to speak out. What the police found inside was described as the most disturbing scene ever seen. Beneath the altar, between the concrete and the damp ground, were makeshift graves. 37 bodies, 37 lives they believed were being saved. The smell was unbearable, the scenes indescribable, and even faced with the truth, some congregants continued to defend him. They said it was all part of a divine plan, that he had been betrayed by men, not by God. The case shocked the country. And more than that, it left a question that resonates to this day. How could a man who claimed to preach love turn into a murderer in the name of faith? How could a pastor who promised to free souls end up imprisoning so many beneath the sacred grounds of his own church? This is the kind of story that makes us rethink how blind faith can be, and what happens when the devil learns to speak like a saint. But to understand how it all began, and what led Elijah to believe he was serving God while sowing death, we need to go back to the beginning, to the day the man of God was born. Have you ever believed in someone so much that you would surrender your life into their hands without hesitation? Imagine a man in a dark suit, with a calm voice and a steady gaze, capable of bringing crowds to tears with just one sermon. He spoke of forgiveness, redemption, and salvation with such conviction that no one doubted his connection to the divine. His name was Pastor Elias Montero, and its church, built in a small rural town, seemed like a refuge of faith. But what no one knew was that beneath that sacred ground lay the most terrible of secrets, a secret that would transform belief into a nightmare and the sacred into a scene of horror. The story of the preacher who freed souls began like so many other stories of faith. Simple people, tired of life's pain, sought solace in the promise of a miracle, and Elias offered exactly that. Redemption, purpose, and a sense of being closer to God. His services were moving, filled with singing and tears. People said they left feeling light, healed, renewed. But at nightfall, when the lights went out and the worshippers left, the pastor remained alone, silent inside the temple. It was at that moment that his true face emerged, one that not even the angels would dare look upon. Everything began to change when the first faithful disappeared. A young volunteer helping with church construction, a woman who attended prayer meetings, then a single mother, last seen kneeling before the altar. Elias always had a ready explanation, a convincing word. They were called to serve elsewhere, he would say, his tone so calm it dispelled any doubt. And so, for months, perhaps years, horror grew in the shadow of faith. What seemed like a blessed ministry would soon reveal itself to be a factory of death. And no one, not even the police, imagined what was about to be uncovered. The case came to light by chance, during a routine inspection following an anonymous tip. Investigators expected to find irregular documents, perhaps something financial. But what they found was much worse. The smell was the first sign, a sweet, strong odor impossible to ignore. Beneath the altar floor, the excavations revealed layers of carefully buried bodies, 37 victims, all connected to the church, all considered converted or purified. It was the altar of faith, transformed into a cemetery of devotion. And the man who presented himself as a liberator was actually imprisoning souls in a way no one could have ever imagined. The news exploded. Within hours, the pastor's name was in every headline. Journalists from across the country descended on the small town, and the congregants, shocked, refused to believe it. Many wept in front of the cameras, saying it was all a trap of the devil, a hoax to destroy a man of God. Others, more courageous, began to speak out, describing strange rituals, healing sessions in which Elijah ordered people to keep their eyes closed, while he murmured words in languages no one understood. It was the beginning of the deconstruction of a myth. Pastor Elias Montero, the messenger of the Lord, had revealed himself as one of the most bizarre and unknown serial killers in modern true crime. But the most disturbing thing is that, even after his arrest, he still believed himself to be a divine instrument. He said the bodies were offerings, and that each freed soul brought him closer to paradise. An explanation that not even the most experienced investigators could fully understand. And perhaps that's why this case remains, to this day, shrouded in mystery, fear, and disbelief. What led this man to believe he killed in the name of God? And how did so many blindly follow him, unaware of the abyss into which they were falling? Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you, and perhaps make you rethink what it truly means to have faith. Before we dive into this sinister case, please subscribe and leave a comment about which country and city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has reached. Do you believe someone is born, destined to save lives, or destroy them? Pastor Elias Montero's story seems, at first glance, to be that of a man chosen by God, a poor boy, rejected and forgotten by everyone, who one day discovered faith and decided to dedicate his life to serving others. But behind this image of purity, there was something no one noticed, a void that grew silently, a darkness that fed on the devotion of others. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. Elias was born in an isolated village where time seemed to stand still. The son of an alcoholic bricklayer and a deeply religious mother, he grew up surrounded by violence and prayer. When his father arrived home drunk and broke everything in the house, his mother would kneel before a crucifix and say, "God will protect you, my son. He has a purpose for you." And the boy believed. He would spend hours locked in his small room, staring at the cracked ceiling and trying to imagine what that purpose might be. Gradually, he began repeating his mother's prayers, then reciting them aloud in front of his neighbors. Some said the boy had a gift. Others said there was something strange in his eyes, a cold, distant, almost disturbing gleam. As a teenager, Elijah began preaching in public squares, markets, and dirt streets. He spoke with a conviction that impressed even the most skeptical. "God showed me the way," he would say, holding up a worn Bible. People stopped to listen, captivated by his eloquence and the way his words seemed to pierce their hearts. This is how, little by little, he gained followers, simple, desperate people seeking comfort and direction. And Elijah offered exactly that: comfort, faith, and a sense of belonging. But there was something in his voice, an almost imperceptible note of arrogance that made some uncomfortable, as if, deep down, he believed himself to be more than a messenger, as if he saw himself as the chosen one. Have you ever met someone like that? The kind of person who turns faith into power, who speaks with such certainty that it's impossible to doubt. Elijah discovered early on that words could dominate more than any weapon. The more he preached, the more people surrendered. And the more they admired him, the more he became convinced he had a greater mission, not just to spread the gospel, but to purify the unclean. It was at this point that something inside him began to distort. Prayers became commands, faith became control, and devotion became submission. His sermons became more intense, almost theatrical. He wept, screamed, trembled before the pulpit, and the congregation did the same. There was something magnetic about the scene, a man who seemed possessed by something divine, or perhaps by something much darker. People knelt, touched his feet, and asked for blessings. Elijah smiled, closed his eyes, and said he felt the presence of God within him. But those who knew him closely noticed small cracks in this sacred facade, unprovoked outbursts of anger, long, cold stares, a strange fixation on stories of punishment and purification. Over time, his name began to spread. From village to village, people spoke of the man of God, who healed, delivered, and transformed lives. He became an almost mythical figure, respected and feared. Local churches began inviting him to preach, and each appearance was a spectacle of faith and emotion. But something always seemed off, as if with each speech, with each shout of hallelujah, something darker was awakening within him, and it was precisely there, in this moment of ascension and glory, that the man of God began to lose his way. The boy who wanted to serve the divine was on the verge of believing that he himself was divine. And when one becomes convinced of this, the line between the sacred and the profane simply disappears. But to understand the depths, too, which Elijah was willing to take this belief and the horror it would bring to dozens of innocent lives, we need to delve deeper into his journey, because it's precisely here that his faith begins to transform into something far more dangerous. Have you ever wondered what happens when faith stops liberating and starts imprisoning? Pastor Elias Montero knew exactly how to transform belief into obedience. In the eyes of the town, he was the man of God, a spiritual leader who preached love and salvation. But within the walls of his church, the reality was quite different. There his every word was law, and his every look made the faithful bow. The service grew, the community grew stronger, and what had seemed like a house of prayer began to become an empire of fear. It all began innocently enough. Entire families moved near the church, leaving behind jobs, friends, and even relatives. Elijah said the outside world was corrupt, that only within his congregation could there be purity and protection. "Here we are safe from evil," he repeated in every sermon, with a conviction that left no room for doubt. The people believed. They sold everything they had and gave it to the temple for the work of the Lord. Gradually, the village emptied, and the territory around the church became a small kingdom, with Elijah on the throne and dozens of followers ready to do anything for him. What no one realized was that as the cult grew, his control tightened. He established rules for everything: what to wear, what to eat, who to talk to. The faithful were forced to confess their sins in front of everyone, weeping, begging for forgiveness. Sometimes confessions lasted for hours. Elijah listened silently, with his hands folded, and at the end, he would say who was forgiven and who needed to undergo purification. This was how he maintained his power, by manipulating fear, regret, and guilt. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt so dominated by someone that even seeing the absurd, you couldn't react? That's exactly how Elijah's followers lived. They believed he spoke directly to God, that he saw what no one else could. And he used this to control every thought, every choice, every emotion. Any doubt was a sin. Any criticism was demonic possession. Hell begins in the minds of those who doubt, he said. And this phrase became a mantra repeated by everyone. The purification rituals began soon after. At first, they consisted of prayers and fasting. Then came the secret nocturnal sessions in which Elijah claimed to expel evil from the bodies of the faithful. No one knew exactly what happened inside, only that people emerged different. Some returned with marks on their bodies. Others remained silent with a blank stare, as if something inside them had been forcibly ripped out. And yet no one dared question. After all, who would doubt the man who spoke in the name of God? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. Elijah's dominion wasn't limited to faith. He invaded people's minds, bodies, and even souls. He made them believe they were incurable sinners, that only his cure could save them from eternal fire. It was a prison without bars, built on fear and devotion. And the more fear they felt, the stronger his grip became. Neighbors began to notice something was wrong. Children who once played in the street disappeared. Men who worked outside the home quit their jobs. Women began wearing the same clothes and walking in silence as if they had lost their will. But when anyone tried to approach, they were met with suspicious looks and warning whispers. "Don't mess with the Lord's anointed," they said. Elijah had achieved what he had always wanted, an army of faithful believers, willing to obey without thought, without question, without shirk. And the more he controlled them, the further the cult drifted from any trace of humanity. What had begun as a promise of faith now breathed like a cult and was about to plunge into an even darker abyss. But to understand how far the pastor was able to take his madness disguised as faith, we need to enter the walls of that church and see what was really happening behind the songs and prayers. Have you ever noticed how silence can be more frightening than any scream? In highly religious communities, this silence sometimes hides more than simple devotion. This is what happened in the church of Pastor Elias Montero, the man of God who promised to free souls, but began mysteriously losing members. No one spoke about it openly. No one asked. They simply disappeared. And the rest of the congregation continued praying as if nothing had happened. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you and perhaps make you think twice before blindly trusting anyone who speaks in the name of faith. The first disappearances began discreetly, almost imperceptibly. A young woman named Clara, who had attended services since the beginning, stopped showing up. The pastor said she had been sent on a spiritual mission and would return when God allowed. Then a newly converted couple disappeared from the village, and Elias explained that they had moved to fulfill a promise of service to the Lord. No one dared doubt it. After all, questioning the pastor was the same as questioning God, but something was wrong. The letters these people usually sent never arrived. Family members who tried to contact them were shunned, ignored, or threatened with divine excommunication. People began to whisper in the aisles between songs. "Have you seen Clara?" And Mr. Antunes, who helped with the construction. Elias, noticing the conversations, stepped up to the pulpit and transformed fear into obedience. With a cold stare, he said, "The enemy is among us. Anyone who doubts the Lord's work has already fallen into temptation," and silence reigned again. It was there that faith became an invisible prison, a chain of guilt and terror. At each service, the pastor reinforced the idea that the outside world was taken over by the devil. He said that salvation was only within the church, and that anyone who strayed was condemned to eternal damnation. Fear took hold. Families began to monitor one another, reporting any suspicious behavior to Elias himself. People lived like shadows, repeating prayers, following absurd rules, and avoiding any thought that could be interpreted as doubt. It was as if each believer's mind had been hijacked. Have you ever been there? Have you ever believed in someone so much that you stopped trusting yourself? As the months passed, more people disappeared. Records of the faithful's arrivals and departures began to disappear. Names were crossed out of attendance registers without explanation. The empty chairs grew, but no one spoke about them. The pastor said that those absent had ascended in spirit, and the congregation wept, believing they were in paradise. Fanaticism had replaced reason, even when some residents of the neighboring town began to question what was happening there. Elijah's followers closed themselves off completely. They defended their leader tooth and nail, saying he was a victim of persecution, a martyr sent by God to test the faith of the righteous. Fear and devotion mingled in an impossible cycle to break. The people no longer knew what was truth and what was sin. Elijah had convinced them that everything that happened was part of a divine plan, and that suffering was necessary for purification. No one imagined that beneath that altar purification had another meaning, one that could never be explained in words. The most disturbing thing is that, even when the families began contacting the police, the parishioners themselves lied to protect the pastor. They said the missing were fine, traveling, serving God. No bodies had been found, no traces left. Only faith and silence. A silence so dense it seemed to scream from within the church walls. But everything that is hidden sooner or later comes to light. And when the truth began to reveal itself, not even the most faithful could continue to believe, because what was about to be discovered beneath that sacred temple was something none of them were prepared to see. Have you ever felt the air suddenly change? That dense, heavy feeling, as if the very environment concealed something terrible. That's exactly what investigators felt when they walked through the doors of Pastor Elias Montero's church. The place was silent, and the smell, a sweet, rotten odor, seemed to permeate every corner of the temple. What they were about to discover inside would forever change the meaning of the word faith. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing revelations ever recorded in a real-life case of crime and religious fanaticism. The operation began at dawn. Police had received anonymous reports of missing persons, and all the clues led to the same address, the Church of the Celestial Redemption, where Elias had preached for over 10 years. From the outside, the church looked ordinary, white walls, an aged bell, and neatly lined wooden pews. But as soon as one of the officers opened the front door, the world changed color. The air was thick, almost solid, and the smell betrayed that something was deeply wrong. Police officers walked slowly through the corridors. The candles were still lit, and the open Bible on the pulpit looked freshly used. Everything was in place, except that underground, the earth appeared to have been recently disturbed. One of the officers noticed small cracks in the altar floor and asked to begin digging. It was then that the horror revealed itself. Beneath the sacred structure, black bags were piled high, covered in lime and earth. The first was carefully opened, but a single glance was enough for the silence to turn to screams. Inside, the body of a woman, still wearing the necklace she wore to worship. And that was just the beginning. As the excavation progressed, more bags were found, dozens of them. Some contained whole bodies, others fragments. 37 in total. Men, women, young people. All churchgoers. The place that should have been a place of prayer had become a cemetery disguised as an altar. The most experienced officers later confessed that they had never experienced anything so disturbing. One of them testified that he seemed to hear voices coming from the walls, as if the temple still held the desperate prayers of the victims. In the pastor's office, investigators found diaries, confession tapes, and ritual notes. On one page, Elias had written, "Every soul freed is an offering. Every body surrendered is a stepping stone to paradise," words that chilled the blood of all who read them. The man who claimed to free souls believed he was fulfilling a divine mission, but his salvation cost human lives. Can you imagine the shock of that community? Believers who, until the day before, had called Elijah a prophet, now saw the pastor's name plastered across the headlines as that of a serial killer. Some wept, others denied it. Many said it was impossible, that it was all just a trap set by the devil. Even in the face of the bodies, there were those who continued to believe the man of God was innocent. This mixture of faith and denial is what makes this case so incomprehensible. What struck the experts most was Elias's coolness when he was arrested. No sign of remorse, no trace of fear. When asked if he had anything to say about the victims, he simply replied, "I freed them. The body dies, but the soul lives in God." Words spoken with the same serenity as someone giving a blessing. The altar of the dead would then become one of the darkest cases in the country's criminal history, an extreme example of how faith can be twisted to the brink of insanity. But what drove Elijah to commit such an atrocity? And how did no one notice the signs that something so monstrous was happening right before their eyes? Stay with me, because what follows will reveal not only the darkest details of this crime, but also the mind of a man who believed he was the very hand of God. Have you ever stopped to think about how someone could use God's name to justify evil? Pastor Elias Montero believed he was the chosen one, the man sent to free souls and lead the faithful to salvation. But when the doors of his church were finally opened and the truth came to light, the world discovered that this man of God was, in fact, the architect of a hell hidden beneath the altar. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may make you rethink everything you know about faith, manipulation, and power. After the discovery of the 37 bodies buried inside the temple, the community that once venerated Elijah plunged into an abyss of horror and denial. Many refused to believe. He couldn't do it, they said through tears. Others silently began to realize they had been victims of something much greater, a deception built on sweet words, divine promises, and a faith that little by little became a prison. The image of the charismatic preacher, who spoke with a soft voice and closed eyes in prayer, was now conflated with that of a cold-blooded killer, capable of transforming people's devotion into an instrument of control. During the trial, Elias maintained the same serene demeanor he displayed in the pulpit. When the judge asked if he acknowledged what he had done, he calmly replied, "I didn't kill anyone. I only freed the souls that were given to me. No remorse, no regret." Witnesses, former believers, police officers, neighbors, reported the same blank stare, the same expression of absolute certainty. He truly believed himself to be a messenger of the divine. And perhaps that was the most frightening aspect of the whole story. He wasn't pretending. Elias believed. Psychiatrists labeled him a religious psychopath, someone who confused faith with power and power with salvation. But for the victims' families, no explanation was enough. They watched the news, the testimonies, and the photos of the ruined church, trying to understand when everything was lost. How could a man who spoke of love and forgiveness be capable of such cruelty? How could so many blindly follow him, unaware of the abyss that lay ahead? Have you ever been there? Have you ever trusted someone so much that you failed to see the danger until it was too late? Over time, the church was demolished. Where chants once rang out, now only debris covered in weeds and a rusty sign remain, warning, "Property under investigation." Local residents avoid passing by. They say that at night, murmurs can still be heard coming from the ground, voices asking for forgiveness, whispers of prayers never completed. Faith, once a symbol of hope, has become trauma. And every person who lived under the influence of that false prophet bears, to this day, invisible scars. Elias died in prison, in solitary confinement, after refusing food for days. The medical report refers to multiple organ failure, but many believe he simply gave up on life, or believed God had finally called him. No relatives came to claim his body. No faithful attended his funeral. His grave is a nameless tombstone, lost among hundreds of others, marked only with a number. A silent end for the man who preached with shouts and promises of eternity. He claimed to save souls, but perhaps he never believed in his own salvation. Pastor Elias. Montero's story is a cruel reminder of how faith can be used as a weapon, how hope can become an instrument of destruction when placed in the wrong hands. If this story shocked you as much as it shocked me, share the video and tell us in the comments, to what extent do you think faith can blind someone? Because in the end, perhaps the real hell is not beneath the earth, but within those who believe they are above all. It's difficult to hear a story like this and come away unscathed. Because deep down, it's not just about Pastor Elias Montero. It's about all of us. About our need to believe, to seek answers, to trust in something or someone that makes us feel safe amidst the chaos. And that's precisely where the danger lies. When faith becomes dependence and love for the divine transforms into blind obedience to a man who claims to be God's spokesperson. It's painful to think that 37 people lost their lives believing they were being saved. But even more painful is realizing how many others remain trapped in the same kind of deception, in different forms, every day. If this topic resonates with you, if this story somehow made you reflect on the power of faith and the limits of human manipulation, leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your opinion, your perception, or even if you've experienced something similar, because when you comment, we're not just telling a story, we're opening a space for real conversation, where every voice matters. And if you believe this kind of content needs to reach more people who may not yet realize how much they can be manipulated by charismatic leaders or false promises of salvation, then watch this video right now. It seems simple, I know, but your click is what allows more people to access stories like this, stories that reveal, that awaken, that make us question. And of course, if you enjoy this kind of dark, profound, and true-to-life narrative, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next episodes, because each new case I bring here is a piece of a larger puzzle about the darker side of faith, the mind, and human nature. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and continues to bring to light what many would prefer to keep hidden. After all, it's together that we transform silence into voice. By commenting, liking, and subscribing, you help this message spread. And maybe, just maybe, prevent stories like Elias Montero's from happening again. But the story isn't over yet. Because what happened after the false prophet's arrest reveals something even more disturbing. Something that shows the depths of human shadow power when it believes it's serving the light. Have you ever stopped to think that evil rarely presents itself with the face of evil? Sometimes it comes disguised as light, as kindness, as someone who speaks softly and smiles, with eyes full of compassion. This is how the story of Pastor Elias Montero began, the man who claimed to free souls, but hid hell beneath his own altar. The small church at the top of the hill seemed like a spiritual refuge. The windows were decorated with stained glass. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of faith, and the sound of the hymns echoed through the valley like a promise of peace. But there was something about that place that didn't match the purity he preached. A strange chill, a presence no one could explain. Some said it was the Holy Spirit, others that it was just the wind. But the wind doesn't carry the scent of death. The faithful arrived early, dressed in their finest clothes, bringing offerings, flowers, and baskets of food. Elias welcomed them with a long, almost paternal embrace, and told them that each of them was a chosen one. His voice had a mesmerizing power. When he spoke, people forgot time, forgot their doubts, even forgot themselves. He promised healing, forgiveness, prosperity, and each word came out as if it were a divine revelation. The problem was that no one realized that what he truly offered wasn't salvation. It was surrender. Total, unconditional, blind surrender. There was something about Elijah that was both attractive and frightening. His gaze was deep, intense, almost predatory. Some believers said that when he looked at them, it was as if he saw everything, their sins, their secrets, their lies. And he used this. In his sermons, he spoke directly to people's fears, as if he could guess what was going on inside them. This made him more than a pastor. It made him an untouchable, almost mystical figure. No one doubted him. After all, who would question the man who claimed to speak for God? Over time, the church grew. People from other cities began to show up, curious about the miracles said to take place there. Elijah transformed the temple into a spectacle of faith. There were lights, chants, screams, and fainting spells. People wept, fell to their knees, and claimed to feel the touch of the divine. But what really happened inside was more human and darker than any heavenly intervention. He knew exactly what to do to keep everyone under his sway, a cycle of fear and hope. One day he would say God had blessed them. The next, that the devil was lurking, trying to corrupt the weak. And so he became indispensable. Without him, the flock would be lost. Signs that something was wrong began subtly. A suspicious look from a congregant, a whisper among neighbors, a disappearance that no one commented on, out of fear. But fear doesn't stop time, and time has a cruel habit of exposing what's been buried. The smell began to appear first, a strange odor coming from the cracks in the floor. The pastor said it was the plumbing, the mold, anything but what it really was. And the congregants believed him because it was easier to believe a sweet lie than to face a rotten truth. The city began to change. The temple, once a symbol of faith, began to inspire discomfort. Children avoided playing near it. Dogs barked at the closed gate. And yet the services continued as if nothing were wrong. Elias preached louder, with more fervor, perhaps to drown out the sound of his own guilt. He was a man torn between the pulpit and the abyss, between the talk of salvation and the reality of damnation. And to think that everything happened before the eyes of those who believed they were witnessing miracles. This is the cruelest part of the story. No one noticed hell being born within paradise. While voices sang hymns, bodies rotted beneath the altar. Bodies of people who had come here seeking peace, forgiveness, a second chance. People who believed until the end that they were in the hands of a saint. And they were, but a saint who possessed the cold touch of death. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the case of Elias Montero is not just a crime story. It's a story about power, about mindset, about the devastating impact a single man can have when he learns to manipulate faith. It's about the hidden truth that exists in every form of fanaticism, and about how fear can transform devotion into submission. It's a journey through the shadows of what we believe to be sacred, and the fine line between faith and madness. The scariest thing is realizing that at some point we could all have been part of this story, because the human mind seeks leaders, seeks purpose, seeks answers. And sometimes, when these answers come packaged in beautiful words and divine promises, we stop questioning. The danger lies precisely there. The moment we stop thinking and just start following. Elias Montero dominated the stage, but he also dominated consciences. He knew how to use every detail, the tone of voice, the pause mid-sentence, the touch on the forehead of the faithful. He created an environment where no one dared to disagree, where guilt and fear were the currency of exchange for hope. The result was a community that believed it was experiencing a miracle, when in fact it was hostage to a nightmare. And perhaps most disturbing of all is understanding that, even after the truth came to light, there were still those who defended him, who said Elijah had been tested by God, that his actions were part of a divine plan. This shows how deep manipulation can be, so deep that even in the face of proof, the heart insists on believing. There's something about this story that goes beyond crime. It's about the power of influence, human frailty, and the line between good and evil. When faith is placed in the wrong hands, it ceases to be a light and becomes a weapon. And what happened in that isolated church was exactly that. Faith transformed into an instrument of destruction. comment here. That makes sense to me, because understanding this story is more than knowing a real case. It's seeing how, sometimes, hell can hide behind the sound of an amen. Have you ever wondered how far someone will go when they believe they are the voice of God? In the small town of Serra Dourada, where the dirt streets still raised dust in the evening wind, a man named Elias Monteiro built something that seemed like a miracle. His church, built with donations and pledges, became the center of the community, a place where the sick sought healing, the afflicted sought solace, and the lost sought redemption. The white facade reflected the sun from within, and the sound of hymns echoed as a reminder that within there was hope. Or so everyone believed. Elijah spoke with an almost supernatural calm. His voice was deep, captivating, and he always seemed to know what each person needed to hear. He didn't just preach, he enchanted. He called people by name, remembered their problems, and claimed to have dreams about them. His every word carried an almost hypnotic power, as if he were able to penetrate the hearts of the faithful and settle there. This is how, little by little, he won them over. Women called him a prophet. Men followed him as if he were a spiritual commander. Children admired him, and the elderly venerated him. But behind the holiness lay a silent restlessness, a hidden truth that not even the most attentive could see. Faith, once nourishment for the soul, began to turn to poison. Elijah declared he was waging war against the forces of evil, and that only the pure would survive the coming judgment. With this, he planted fear in the hearts of those who followed him. Fear of making mistakes, of disobeying, of doubting. And this fear was what made him untouchable. Little by little, he began to change the rules. He asked for sacrifices of time, money, and above all, obedience. He said that God spoke to him at night, and that certain souls needed to be purified. People believed him because Elijah wasn't just a shepherd. He was the bridge between heaven and earth. And who would dare go against God's own chosen one? The curious thing is that no one could say exactly when things began to spiral out of control. It was all so gradual, so subtle, that it seemed natural. First came the all-night vigils, then the confession rituals, in which the faithful were forced to expose their secrets before everyone. Elias said that only the truth would set them free, but he used these confessions to manipulate, humiliate, and break down each person's resistance. When the mind yields, the body obeys, and that's how he created a flock that no longer knew what to think, only what to believe. The surrounding community began to find the followers' behavior strange. They avoided contact, spoke only about the church, and eyed anyone who questioned Elias with suspicion. Some merchants claimed the faithful sold everything they had and gave it to the pastor for the glory of the Lord. Others swore they had seen strange things, trucks arriving at night, candles lit on the hills, prayers in languages no one understood. But anyone who tried to approach was repelled with hostility. No one enters here without divine permission, they said. Elijah's power grew so much that he began to see himself as above the law. And perhaps the most frightening thing is realizing that evil didn't appear all at once. It was born gradually, between sermons hidden in the silences. What began as faith turned into fanaticism. What was devotion turned into submission. And when the truth finally came to light, it was too late. It was an anonymous tip that led police to the scene. The reason, according to records, was suspicious activity and missing persons. No one imagined what they would find. When investigators walked through the church doors, the smell was the first clue, a thick, sweet, and repulsive odor. The floor seemed damp and the air too heavy to breathe. The prayers painted on the walls seemed to mock those who entered. And there, beneath the altar where so many had knelt seeking forgiveness, lay the secret Elias had kept for years, 37 bodies. The case shocked the country, but what drew the most attention was the reaction of the faithful. Many refused to believe it. They said it was all a lie, that the bodies had been planted by the police. Others wept, saying that Elijah had been betrayed, that he was the true martyr of the faith. Even in the face of the evidence, some still called him Saint Elijah, The manipulation was so profound that not even death could break the bond between the pastor and his followers. This story has been covered in the news, documentaries, books, and investigations, yet it remains shrouded in mystery. How did one man manage to deceive so many people? How did a preacher transform a simple church into a temple of horror? And most importantly, how did no one see the signs? The case of Elias Montero is a grim portrait of the power of the human mind, the fragility of faith, and the devastating impact of limitless leadership. He used religion as a mask, hope as bait, and fear as a tether. The result was a tragedy that still echoes in the city's memories, in the scars left on the ground, and in the empty gazes of those who survived his influence. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this story isn't just about a crime, but about the silent transformation that happens when we surrender our thoughts to someone who promises to guide us. It's about decisions, about mindset, and about the dangerous boundary between truth and illusion. The Elias Montero case is more than a tragedy. It's a mirror of what happens when the desire to believe becomes greater than the will to see. Comment here. That makes sense to me, because understanding this story isn't just about reliving the past. It's about recognizing how, sometimes, the greatest nightmare can be born within what we call faith. Since childhood, Elias Montero's eyes had a mixture of emptiness and intensity that frightened even adults. He was born in a small village, where the silence of the night was broken only by the distant sound of dogs and his parents' arguments. His deeply religious mother said the boy was marked by God. His father, a violent and alcoholic man, said the opposite, that the boy had the devil in his body. Amid crosses, screams, and prayers, Elias grew up trying to understand which of the two voices was the true one. He learned early on that pain could be disguised as faith. When he was beaten, his mother made him kneel before the crucifix and repeat, "God has a purpose for you." And he believed. He spent hours staring at that wooden Christ nailed to the wall, trying to decipher what it meant to suffer for a greater good. As he grew older, he began to imitate the preachers he saw on the radio. He would grab a stick, climb a rock, and preach to the trees, the birds, anything that breathed. It was as if the boy was speaking to someone no one else could hear. As a teenager, his outlook changed. There was something cold and calculated, but also a gleam of someone who felt different. When his mother died, Elias was left alone. He was taken in by a small local church, where he began helping with services. There, he discovered the power he had always sought, the power of words. When he spoke, people stopped. It was as if his voice carried a weight, a magnetism, and he quickly realized this. What began as devotion became a strategy. Elijah understood that faith moved people, and that those who knew how to command that faith could move anything. He began to study the Bible with an almost unhealthy obsession, not just to understand the message, but to learn how to use it. He observed the gestures of the more experienced pastors, the cadence of their sermons, the precise tone that made the crowd cry. He began to shape his own style. He spoke softly when he wanted to attract attention, shouted when he wanted to make an impact. He discovered that between fear and hope there is a space, and that space is called control. The first people who followed him called him the enlightened young man. They said he healed with just his touch. And indeed, there was something almost mystical about his presence. Women reported strange sensations while listening to him preach. Men swore he had the gift of revelation. With each word he spoke, he became more admired. And within him, a certainty began to grow that he was different, special, chosen. It was at this point that faith ceased to be belief and became vanity. Time passed, and Elijah became a pastor. His reputation spread to neighboring towns. Ordinary people traveled miles to hear him. He preached not fear but liberation. He spoke of a God who did not punish but purified. And each time someone wept into his hands, Elijah felt something grow within him, a sweet sense of power. He began to believe he could heal not only bodies, but souls. that he could decide who was worthy of salvation and who was beyond forgiveness. Little by little, signs of darkness began to appear. During services, he would stare at people as if examining prey. He would maintain long periods of silence, staring at someone in the crowd until they felt exposed. Sometimes he would suddenly call someone over and say, "God has shown me your sin." People would tremble, cry, confess anything, and he would smile satisfied, as if confirming what he already knew. There was something subtly cruel in that gesture, a small spark of what would become his true face. As the months passed, Elias began to develop an almost messianic image. People called him the man of God, and he let them. Deep down he liked it. He had his own image painted at the church entrance, embracing a cross. He claimed the design was merely symbolic, but those who knew him knew he loved to be venerated. He began wearing simple but impeccable white clothes and demanded that no one call him by his first name, just Pastor Elias. Spiritual power became political. The city depended on him. With his influence, he garnered donations, votes, and respect. And anyone who dared doubt the pastor's holiness was quickly silenced. It was said that once a man confronted him during a sermon. Elias stared at him for several seconds and simply said, "God will test you." 3 days later, the man suffered an accident and died. Coincidence or not, no one questioned him after that. But there was something deeper, more dangerous, growing within him. Elijah began to believe his own lies. He believed he truly was a divine instrument, that God was speaking directly to him. He spent nights locked in the church, claiming he was in communion. The faithful heard sounds, footsteps, sometimes screams. And when they asked what had happened, he would reply, "The Spirit visited me." No one dared doubt him. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Elias Montero's story is more than a tragedy about faith. It's about the silent transformation that occurs within the minds of those who believe they've found absolute power. It's about the impact of loneliness, unresolved pain, and the need to be seen. His journey reveals how suffering can disguise itself as holiness, and how the desire for redemption can turn into obsession. The most disturbing thing is that the signs were always there. The cold expressions, the overly long gazes, the words that sounded more like orders than prayers. But no one wanted to see them, because seeing them meant admitting that the man who brought peace could also be the bearer of chaos. And human beings have this tendency. They prefer to believe in the illusion that comforts rather than the truth that destroys. Elias Montero wasn't born a monster. He became one, shaped by pain, rejection, and above all, adoration. Each time someone called him a saint, he believed a little more than he truly was. And that was the beginning of the end, the moment an ordinary man began to confuse faith with power, and salvation with dominion. Write it down. I'm on that journey too, because understanding how someone transforms is the first step to recognizing the shadows that sometimes grow within our own faith. After Elias Montero was officially recognized as a pastor, what had previously seemed like mere admiration began to transform into devotion. People followed him with almost blind faith, believing his every word was a direct message from heaven. The church, once small and welcoming, expanded. New believers arrived every day, drawn by reports of healings and miracles that no one knew for sure were true or just part of the myth he himself had helped to construct. Elias spoke with such conviction that even his lies seemed sacred. His steady, penetrating gaze made the faithful feel seen, understood, chosen. And who could doubt a man who seemed to hear the very voice of God? It was during this period that he began to form what he called the community of the purified, a close-knit group composed of the most loyal believers, those who gave not only tithes but their entire lives. Elijah said that the world was riddled with sin, and that only those who remained under his guidance would be spared the coming destruction. His message was simple, powerful, and filled with fear. And fear, more than faith, is what truly binds people. Gradually, he isolated his followers. He ordered them to sell their homes, quit their jobs, and cut ties with anyone outside the chosen flock. He created rules for everything: how to dress, what to eat, how to sleep, and even how to think. Women were forbidden from wearing makeup or cutting their hair. Men were forbidden to look directly at strangers. Children were forced to memorize verses and repeat phrases like, "We are the seed of God, and the rest is dust." Everything Elijah did was justified by a verse and a dream, a divine revelation. Services began to take place at night, and the atmosphere inside the church became increasingly tense. The dim lights, closed windows, and the strong smell of incense and anointed oil created a feeling of enclosure. Elijah walked between the rows of pews with a grave expression, touching the heads of the faithful and murmuring prayers in a low voice. He spoke of demons, temptations, and the price of deliverance. Those who disobeyed were exposed before everyone. Confessions were public. People knelt in the center of the church, weeping, begging for forgiveness, while Elijah accused them of spiritual betrayal. Sometimes the punishment was fasting for days. Other times, he himself conducted what he called a purification ritual, in which the faithful were locked in a dark room and left there alone, praying until they lost track of time. No one doubted him. After all, who would question the man who spoke in the name of God? Elijah knew this, and he wielded this power with surgical precision. His spiritual authority was a perfect mask to hide his psychological control. He said that hell was outside the church walls, and that anyone who left the group would be consumed by evil. The people believed him. Even when hunger gripped them, even when their bodies weakened, no one dared leave. The thought of losing their salvation was more frightening than any physical pain. Elijah also began selecting incurable sinners, people he said were dominated by evil forces and in need of deliverance. These rituals took place out of the sight of the faithful. Some heard screams in the early hours of the morning, others saw dried bloodstains on the ground. When asked, Elijah would calmly respond, "Evil resisted, but God won." His tone was so convincing that no one questioned him anymore. Gradually, terror became part of the routine. The manipulation was so profound that even the impossible seemed acceptable. He used people's love against them. He said that doubt was a temptation, that overthinking was giving space to the devil. Thus people stopped thinking. They believed everything, did everything, surrendered everything. Their minds no longer belonged to them, and Elijah knew it. This was the true miracle he had learned to perform, controlling souls. But there was something different about him lately. A restlessness, a darker look in his eyes, as if Elijah himself were beginning to believe he truly had power over life and death. Some members reported that he claimed to hear voices in the early morning hours, voices commanding the unclean to be cleansed. Those closest to him claimed he began fasting for long periods, saying God was preparing him for a final revelation. With each service, the words became harsher. Love and salvation gave way to threats and punishment. Faith was replaced by obedience. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what Elijah built there wasn't just a church, it was a cruel experiment in human nature. A living study of how far people will go when they believe they're doing the right thing. This kind of manipulation doesn't happen overnight. It's built slowly, with small concessions and false promises. First, the leader earns trust. Then they take control of emotions. And finally, they dominate thinking. When this happens, the individual loses the ability to distinguish right from wrong. And the leader takes the place of God within the mind. The scariest thing is that, to those inside, everything seems natural. Abuse comes disguised as care, isolation feels like protection, and suffering is interpreted as purification. Elias understood human behavior. He knew how to break a person and rebuild them in his image. And each time someone surrendered completely, he felt an almost divine euphoria, as if he were shaping their soul with his own hands. That was what fueled him, power, not purpose. Time within that community seemed to flow differently. Days and nights blended into prayers and rituals. The faithful slept little, ate even less. Exhaustion fueled obedience. And the weaker they became, the more dependent on Elijah they became. He had turned fear into a tool and faith into a prison. And deep down, perhaps he believed he was truly fulfilling a divine calling. But the walls of any lie, sooner or later, begin to crack. Small details, suspicious looks, stories that didn't add up. Some believers began to realize that the pastor's light was actually a flame, consuming everything around it. Still, no one had the courage to act. Because when someone controls your mind, even hell seems shaped like an altar. Comment here. That makes sense to me, because understanding what happened to Elias Montero is also understanding how faith, when manipulated, can become the most powerful and dangerous weapon a man can wield. The disappearances began so subtly that, at first, no one noticed. One worshipper would miss one service, then another, and Elias always had a convincing explanation. He would say they had been sent on a mission, that God had called them to serve elsewhere, that they were purifying their spirits in isolation. His words sounded so firm, so serene, that no one dared doubt them. The truth is that behind that calm, authoritative tone, the pastor had already discovered the perfect weapon, fear disguised as faith. He knew that the more the faithful feared disappointing God, the less they would question his actions. And so each absence was transformed into an act of God, a supposed blessing that hid something far more sinister. Families began to miss their loved ones. Mothers went to church seeking news of their children and were greeted with prayers. Elias placed his hands on their heads, asking them to trust, saying that God's timing is not the timing of men. The women left crying, their hearts torn between grief and belief. Some returned days later, asking to stay in the congregation as well. "I want to be closer to my son. I want to be part of the work," they said. And Elias smiled. This was how the cycle renewed itself. Loss fueled faith, and faith erased any trace of doubt. What few knew was that while prayers echoed inside the temple, records and documents were carefully erased. Baptisms disappeared from the books. Photos were removed from the walls. Names vanished from membership lists. Elias called this spiritual cleansing. For him, those who ceased to exist on earth were simply returning to the arms of God. The faithful believed. No one wondered why families never received letters, phone calls, or even a final goodbye. As the months passed, the signs became clearer, but also easier to ignore. People were tired, with dark circles under their eyes and trembling voices. They slept little, ate even less. Their routine consisted of endless fasts and long vigils, during which Elijah preached about the apocalypse and the purification of the chosen. He spoke of a new world, a place where only the faithful would survive. "The rest will be consumed by fire," he said, and each word echoed in the exhausted minds of the congregation until fear completely replaced reason. Some tried to escape. A woman named Joanna was seen leaving the church in the middle of the night, carrying a suitcase and her face streaked with tears. The next day, Elias told the congregation that she had been taken by the enemy. His tone was sad and pious, but his eyes betrayed something else, a kind of grim satisfaction. Joanna was never heard from again. After that, no one tried to escape. Fear had become a wall. Silence began to take over the town. What had once been admiration turned to distrust. Neighbors noticed residents disappearing, but no one had the courage to report it. Elias's authority was so great that it transcended the bounds of faith and infiltrated politics, the police, and even the local press. Anyone who dared question him was immediately labeled a servant of darkness. The pastor had built an empire of control so effective that even those who doubted him eventually fell silent. Blind faith did the rest. Inside the church, the faithful knelt and asked forgiveness for the sins of others, for the missing, for those who fell, for those who could not bear the weight of purification. Elijah fed the collective guilt as if it were a sacred fire. He said that each lost soul was a test sent by God, and that suffering was the currency that bought salvation. And so pain became part of the routine. No one wept for the missing anymore. They wept for themselves, trying to prove they were still worthy of remaining there. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because what Elijah built wasn't just a church, it was a psychological power structure. He transformed faith into dependence and devotion into submission. The believers' mindsets had been shaped to not react, to accept everything as part of a divine plan. This is what makes this kind of manipulation so devastating. The victim believes they are being saved, when in fact they are being destroyed. Elijah understood the human mind with almost surgical precision. He knew when to speak, when to be silent, when to smile, when to impose terror. Every gesture, every word, was part of an invisible mechanism that kept everyone trapped. Families who still tried to contact members of the congregation were instructed to cut ties. They need distance to free themselves from sin, Elias said. Letters never arrived. Phones were turned off, doors were closed, streets were avoided. The isolation was absolute. And the more isolated they became, the more vulnerable they became. The pastor became everything: father, judge, savior, confessor, and executioner. There were no longer boundaries between faith and fear. Some reports say that on certain nights the sound of chanting would mix with muffled screams. The locals preferred not to comment. Fear had spread beyond the church gates and throughout the town. No one wanted to be the next to disappear. Some swore that Elijah's gaze pierced people as if he saw their innermost thoughts. One word from him was enough for a believer to kneel and confess sins they hadn't even committed. This was the essence of his power, not needing to prove anything, just making people believe. Over time, the truth began to crack the veil of belief. Small details began to bother the most attentive. The strange smell coming from the basement. The constantly disturbed earth near the altar. The disappearance of workers working on the church's renovations. But when anyone dared to question, Elias would calmly reply, "Do you doubt the house of God?" And silence would return. The faithful lived trapped between two forces, the fear of losing their salvation and the fear of discovering the truth. This was the perfect trap. And within it, Elijah continued to reign, increasingly distant from the man he had once believed himself to be, a servant of God. Now he saw himself as God himself, the one who could decide who would live, who would die, who would be remembered, and who would be erased. Comment here. That makes sense to me, because understanding the silence of the faithful is understanding the power of manipulation, and realizing how faith, when blind, can become the darkest of prisons. The complaint arrived anonymously, written hastily on a yellowed piece of paper that looked like it had been ripped from an old notebook. No signature, just one sentence. "His salvation smells like death." The police almost ignored the note until they realized the name mentioned, Elias. Montero was the same one that had been appearing in missing persons reports in the area for over 2 years. And so, with a small team and an almost unlikely suspect, they decided to enter the church that the people called House of Redemption. That morning the sky was covered in heavy clouds. The hot wind brought an uneasy silence, and even the birds seemed to avoid the sacred grounds. The church's white, weathered facade hid something human eyes were unprepared to see. When the officers pushed open the wooden doors, a thick, sweet smell immediately hit them. One of the officers vomited before even taking 2 steps. The air was almost palpable, a mixture of incense, sweat, and something that could only be described as ancient death. The lights were on, as if someone had left for a moment. The pews were lined up, Bibles open to verses about forgiveness and purity of soul. On the altar stood a large wooden cross, stained at its base with something dark, almost black. The floor, covered in worn carpets, exuded the same odor that came from the basement. With each step, a damp crunch sounded under the investigators' boots. One of them, Sergeant Amaral, commented in a low voice, "This isn't a house of worship. It's a grave." That's when one of them found the first crack in the floor. It looked fresh, as if someone had tried to fill it in a hurry. When they removed the carpet, the earth was disturbed. The shovels began to work, and the sound of metal against concrete echoed like a heartbeat within those silent walls. The first body emerged shortly after, wrapped in a white sheet marked with strange symbols drawn in red paint. The face was distorted, the eyes still open, as if they had seen something indescribable. The second body was less than a meter away, the third just below, and then, when they realized the pattern, panic spread. The entire ground was a cemetery. Each layer of earth bore more human remains, 37 in total. Men, women, young, old, all members of Elias's congregation. Many still wore the necklaces and bracelets he distributed during services, symbols of deliverance. One of them had a note pinned to his chest, with a single sentence written in crooked letters, "Now I am clean." The researcher's account describes the scene as something beyond any human experience. The smell, the frozen expressions, the contrast between the hymns open on the pages of the Bibles and the bodies rotting beneath the altar. One of the officers fainted. Another wept. And Sergeant Amaral, the same one who had smelled death upon entering, noted in his report, "It seems their faith remained alive. Even after their bodies had given up, when Elias was found, he was kneeling at the back of the church, covered in dirt, praying silently. He didn't try to escape, didn't react, didn't say a word until they handcuffed him. His look, according to the police, showed no fear, only conviction. During the interrogation, he remained calm, almost serene. He said that the souls had been freed and that the flesh was just a shell for sin. When the prosecutor asked if he recognized the bodies found under the altar, Elias smiled slightly and replied, "Yes, I do. They were chosen. Now they are with God." The forensic experts found evidence of rituals performed with almost scientific precision. There were notebooks, circle drawings, and detailed instructions on spiritual purification through complete surrender. In one passage, Elias had written, "Blood is the seal of truth. It is in the silence of the flesh that the soul cries out loudest." The phrase was cited several times during the trial, but to this day, no one has been able to fully decipher what he meant by it. The testimonies of the surviving believers were even more disturbing. Many claimed that Elijah claimed to hear voices during prayers, voices asking for sacrifices. Others said he spent entire nights talking to himself, repeating the words, "We must open the door for the light to enter." One woman said that days before the police arrived, he had said that the final liberation was near and that God would come for the pure first. No one questioned what this meant. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the story of the discovery of the bodies goes beyond a crime. It reveals the psychological impact of faith when used as an instrument of domination, and how the mindset of an entire group can be shaped by the voice of a single person. It's a brutal lesson in the power of belief and the limits of obedience. What happened inside that church wasn't just a mass murder. It was a perverse transformation of spirituality into manipulation. Elias understood better than anyone how guilt, fear, and the need for redemption can become invisible weapons. The most frightening thing is to perceive the contrast between the sacred and the profane in that place. The walls still bore verses about forgiveness, while the floor hid the evidence of a silent condemnation. Every candle lit there, every hymn sung, was a disguise for something terribly human, the desire for absolute power. And the cruelest thing is that Elijah sincerely believed he was doing the right thing. In the letters he wrote before his arrest, he said that the world had turned away from God and that he had been chosen to correct the crooked ways of humanity. But deep down, what he truly sought was control, total mastery over the minds and bodies of his followers. And he achieved it. He transformed faith into submission, hope into fear, and the altar, a symbol of eternal life, into a portal to death. The horror wasn't in the walls nor in the ground. It was in his mind, and perhaps in some way, in the minds of all who blindly believed his words. Researchers say that even years later, the temple still emitted a strange, unidentifiable odor. Some said it was merely a remnant of the bodies. Others believed that evil had remained trapped there, impregnated in the walls. The truth is, no one has been able to completely erase Elias Montero's trail. Not the police, not the church, not the city. That building has become a symbol of what happens when faith surpasses the limits of reason, when devotion gives way to blind obedience. Comment here. That makes sense to me, because understanding what was discovered under that altar is also understanding how far human beings can go in the name of faith, and how the search for salvation can, at times, lead us straight to hell. Elias Montero was arrested in silence. Not a word, not a gesture of repentance, just a fixed, distant gaze, as if he still believed he was in control. During the trial, he maintained the same cold demeanor he displayed at the altar. He spoke slowly, quoted verses, and smiled when confronted with the evidence. He claimed he had committed no crimes, merely fulfilled God's will. For him, the bodies found under the altar were not victims, they were martyrs. People who, in his own words, had accepted the sacrifice in the name of purification. The entire courtroom froze upon hearing this. Faith had turned to madness. Prosecutors attempted to create a psychological profile. Psychiatrists, theologians, and criminologists were summoned to understand the inner workings of that mind. The diagnosis was unanimous. Elijah suffered from a messianic delusion. He believed himself chosen, endowed with a sacred mission to cleanse the world of sins. But the most frightening thing was the way his mind worked, logical, articulate, methodical. He acted not on impulse, but out of conviction. He planned, calculated, and justified each act with a distorted interpretation of Scripture. He was the embodiment of fanaticism masquerading as faith. As the trial unfolded, the former faithful were divided. Some finally grasped the horror of what they had experienced and rebelled, weeping as they watched the images displayed in court. Others remained faithful, saying it was all a trap set by the enemy. They camped outside the prison, praying for the pastor's release. The human mind has this strange ability to deny the undeniable when the truth becomes too painful to accept. Elijah's power didn't end with his imprisonment. He lived on in the minds of those who believed in him. Inside his cell, he maintained a prayer routine. He would spend hours kneeling, muttering biblical passages, and writing meaningless phrases on the walls. When the guards brought him food, he would simply smile and say, "Fasting is the purest form of being with God." One of them reported that one night, Elijah began preaching to the other inmates, saying that hell was merely an invention to test the faith of the chosen. Soon, some inmates began following him, calling him the prison prophet. Even behind bars, the man continued to exert the same power. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Elias Montero's story isn't just about a murderer. It's about the fragility of the human mind and the devastating impact of a distorted belief. It's about how the need to belong, to have a cause, can be weaponized by those who understand the power of speech. The true horror isn't in the bodies under the altar, but in the transformation that occurs within people when they surrender their thoughts to another human being. Elias didn't force anyone to believe. He simply offered what many were desperate to find: meaning. It is at this point that the line between devotion and fanaticism blurs. Faith, when manipulated, ceases to be light and becomes an invisible prison. The most tragic thing is that most of the people who followed him weren't evil. They were ordinary people, workers, mothers, young people, who found in Elias what the outside world had taken away: hope. And that's what makes his story so heartbreaking. He didn't just destroy lives, he destroyed people's ability to trust, to believe in something good again. A few years later, the pastor was found dead in his cell. The medical report indicated multiple organ failure, a result of his refusal to eat. But prison guards swear he died with his eyes open, a slight smile on his face, as if waiting for someone. On his bed, he had left a shaky note. "They called me a false prophet, but I was just faithful to the end." No signature. Just that heavy silence, the same that once dominated his church. The prison was demolished sometime later, and the land where the House of Redemption stood was abandoned. No one wanted to build anything there. Locals say that on windy nights, voices can still be heard, distant chanting, shuffling footsteps, and an endlessly repeated prayer. Others claim the place is just another symbol of what human beings are capable of when they confuse faith with obedience, love with power, God with vanity. Elijah claimed to save souls, but perhaps he never believed in his own salvation. Perhaps, deep down, he knew there was no heaven waiting for him, only the void he himself created. His name was erased from official records, and the church that once held hundreds of people is now a forgotten ruin. But the echo of his words lives on, a grim reminder that faith in the wrong hands can become the world's most dangerous weapon. Elijah's story is an uncomfortable mirror, because when we look closely, we realize that we all harbor within us the same desire to believe in something greater, and that this desire, if given over to someone without conscience, can transform us into accomplices to the very evil we are trying to combat. This false prophet's journey reveals not only the behind-the-scenes story of a crime, but also the hidden truth about the power of decisions and the impact they have when made without question. Faith is, and always will be, a powerful force, capable of healing, of uniting, of transforming. But it is also a double-edged blade. When used by those seeking control, it cuts deep, leaving no visible scar. Elias proved this in the cruelest way possible. And that is why his story must not be forgotten. Because the danger doesn't end when the monster is trapped. It survives when silence reigns again. When no one dares speak of what happened, comment here, that makes sense to me, because understanding the end of Elias Montero is not just revisiting a crime. It is facing how faith, when lost, can bring us closer to what we swore to fear. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. And perhaps, like me, you've also felt that unease, that mix of curiosity and reflection that arises when we realize how faith, the mind, and human decisions can intertwine in such unpredictable ways. That's exactly why I create these videos, to explore what lies behind appearances, to reveal the hidden side of stories the world prefers to forget. So, if this kind of content resonates with you, if you enjoy this immersion between the real and the dark, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. That way, you can continue to be part of this journey and not miss the next stories to come, because there's still so much to be told, so much hidden truth waiting to be discovered. Also, leave your comment saying, "I'm with you until the end," just so I know you stuck with me until the very last second. I enjoy reading each one, and that's what keeps the connection between the storyteller and the listener alive. Oh, and before you leave a like, not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign that this conversation made you think, feel, and question. This helps the channel continue to grow and shows me that it's worth diving deep into stories like this. There's a video here that complements this theme, a story that, in some way, connects with everything we just saw. Click and stay with me there, because there are truths we only understand when we face what comes next.